People often complain about games that cost too much and offer basically nothing in return. When you spend $60 on a 4-hour adventure, you'd probably feel like you got scammed for your money. The obvious answer to this is that you'd prefer those games to be anywhere from 10, 15, or 20 hours long. That way you get your money's worth and you can enjoy yourself for a much longer time. And that makes sense, right? Well, today we're gonna look at a game that I felt should have been a much shorter experience. Not necessarily a bad game, but one that overstayed its welcome for a bit too long. Soulstice is an action-adventure game created by Reply Game Studios and follows the journey of two sisters as they fight through the city of Ilden, destroying chaotic creatures. You play as Briar, an Ashen Knight with a big-ass sword.
That's a huge bitch!
Then there's her sister Lute, who is the ghost that follows you around and helps you out during combat. I was a little confused at first how these two were sisters, since they look more like a grungy version of Casper and Kat, but they do explain the backstory fairly well as you play through each chapter. I'm not a huge fan of how they do this, since it's told through these sequences called memories. Here you play as Lute as she floats through this void and replays lost parts of Briar's memory. It's pretty boring though, because you're watching these ghostly figures talk as they slightly glow and barely move around. Now these sections only pop up after every 4 chapters, so it's not the worst thing, but if you do care about the overall plot, this is where you're going to get the most juicy details. Speaking of which, the plot is probably one of the best parts of Soulstice. It's built around this group of Ashen Knights who fight against the corruption caused by something called the Tear.
What the hell is this?
You get to see the lore behind it all and meet some interesting characters along the way. Just like Lute is a ghost following around Briar, the other knights also have their own ghosts, which oftentimes are their own friends and family that were bonded to their souls. It's an interesting concept they touch on here and there, but I wish we could have seen even more of that. The other Ashen Knights don't get nearly as much screen time, so unfortunately we don't get to know them as well as Briar and Lute. But I will say without spoiling much that the ending does set up a potential sequel, and I'm totally cool with that. I can tell that a lot of thought went into writing the lore, and I would love to see more of what they're going to do with it all. But that's just the lore, that's just the story parts of the game. What about the actual gameplay? Because I have to say that if there is a sequel, there are a couple things that should probably change gameplay wise in order to make it into an even better experience. Soulstice follows the usual hack and slash standards and feels like it takes some notes from a game like DMC. And yes, I mean the DMC that stars a Dante that looks like he's the lead guitarist in an indie screamo band. You have the variety of weapons you unlock through levels like an axe, a gauntlet, bow, an arrow, and even a whip, all of which you will use in tandem with the sword, and you'll unlock more combos and upgrades for all of them.
That's fine and all, but what makes this like DMC?
Well, I'm glad you ask. That was the first game that came to mind when I thought of the mechanic that they use for these color-coded attacks. In DMC, they introduced a mechanic for both angel and devil attacks, and all the weapons that fall under those categories can be used to defeat certain enemies. So if you have to fight a blue enemy, that's where you're going to have to use your angel weapon, and if you fight a red enemy, that's where you're going to have to use your devil weapon. And Soulstice does the same thing, but with soul energy. Lute plays a pretty important role with her entropy ability. She can create these red or blue barriers that allow you to attack the red and blue creatures that will spawn. The main gimmick here is that you need to fight while maintaining your entropy gauge and using Lute's barrier at the right time. Not only within battles, but also with some of the puzzles and platforming. There's a skill tree to unlock even more of Lute's powers, but even that felt a little bit weird to me. See, Lute is a companion that you don't have much control over. Sure, you'll be activating her barrier and using her to disrupt enemy attacks, but you can't really control what she does. The only real way to control her is through the skill tree itself. It's something I couldn't get a good feel for myself, but I do see people who get really into it. The trees can be focused on a specific alignment like chaos, trickery, mastery, or balance. Each one gives Lute a focus on what attacks she's more likely to use. Now the game doesn't really do the best job of explaining this, but if you're someone who is looking to play this multiple times and unlock all the nodes, you have your work cut out for you. My Lute was focused on balance for a majority of the game, and I'd say it worked out well enough. Now they do throw challenges at you here and there, so if you focus on a specific route, you'll have an easier or harder time depending on what you choose. But I do love the special attacks you unlock about halfway through. Briar becomes filled with this rage and can execute a few different attacks based on loot's affinity. So once you start getting that skill tree expanded, there is so much more that you can do in combat. I will warn you that things don't start off being crazy, since you won't get a lot of these abilities until a few hours in, but after that you start getting into a lot more advanced stuff. So if you're a hardcore player out there, it's something that you can really get invested in. But going back to the start of the video, I said that Soulstice was a bit too long. Now I'm fine with games being more lengthy when they have some good storytelling and fun combat. And while the story here is interesting and the combat isn't too bad either, it still went on for too long. Like, there's some decent ideas in here, but it's dragged down by the dull atmosphere.
What the fuck is this piece of shit?
For example, playing through 5 different levels will make you feel like you're playing through one long level. Most of these places look exactly the same, and when I go from chapter to chapter, I wonder if I even did anything in the first place. And it doesn't really help that there isn't a map feature anywhere, so it makes traveling through each level into a total headache. Like, is this the same dark alley I went through 2 chapters ago, or am I just crazy? You'll fight in the same castles, dungeons, and cathedrals for about 80% of the game. Some levels will introduce new puzzles or enemies, but a majority of them leading to the end of the game get very repetitive. Especially when you get to the last few levels, you end up fighting hordes of enemies in one of the most boring ways imaginable. It's one of those levels where they give you an infinite special attack gauge and take away all the challenge while still making you fight for 20 minutes straight. I'm okay when games have these levels where it feels like you're playing in some sort of god mode, but when you stretch that level out to be all these different sections of this level that you play through almost endlessly, it's like, why are you even putting me through this in the first place? There's a lot of levels in this game that could have been cut out, and I think it would have been more fun if they did. But hey, I'll at least give them credit for making some interesting bosses. There's not as many here as I would have liked, but the designs on the ones that we have are pretty nice. And you can tell they knew exactly what they were doing with one of these bosses.
I have the weirdest boner.
And just in general, I think the boss design is something I'd like to see more of if there is a potential sequel. Soulstice was an experience that started off weak, became exciting, and then ended on a low note for me. If they cut out a bunch of the grindy levels and focused on making the world look more unique, then this would have been some straight fire. Compared to most other hack and slash games, I don't think it's bad, but I also wouldn't recommend it for most. A lot of what Soulstice offers is the same or less than what other games can give you. But if you do care enough to check out what the story has to offer, then it's not a bad game to pick up on discount. But what do you think about Soulstice? Do you mind a game with some less interesting environments? Is the story enough to hold up the entire game? I'd love to hear all your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe for more videos just like this one, and I'll see you all in the next video.